In capitals across Africa, the headlines blazed with promise. Debt erased. Relief delivered. A new dawn, they said. Cameras flashed as ministers smiled beside IMF envoys. Western anchors called it mercy. African treasuries whispered oxygen. The world applauded. But in Ouagadougou, one man did not. Ibrahim Traoré clenched his fist. For behind the speeches was a truth too sharp to ignore. This was no gift. It was a trade. And the price was Africa's lifeblood. Its gold, its oil, its uranium. What is freedom if it demands our chains? What is relief if it mortgaged the soil beneath our feet? Traoré's refusal was more than dissent. It was defiance. It was a young leader standing against the tide, asking the question no one else dared. Is this salvation, or is it a coup without soldiers? Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a turning point history will remember. Subscribe and stand with the story. The stage was set. A battle not of guns, but of contracts. Not of armies, but of signatures. And in the silence between signatures, a reckoning began. It began with applause. In Washington, the IMF announced a historic plan. Billions of dollars in African debt would vanish. Western reporters framed it as generosity, a mercy long overdue. From Brussels to Nairobi, the narrative was uniform. Africa had been given a second chance. Debt erased. New credit lines extended. Disbursements accelerated. A continent gasping for economic air was offered oxygen. In Dar es Salaam, cameras captured ministers signing papers beneath banners of relief. In Kinshasa, finance officials toasted to what they called a victory for stability. In Dakar, headlines declared liberation from the weight of obligations. The phrase partnership renewed appeared again and again in editorials. To many leaders, the offer was irresistible. Clear ledgers, fresh liquidity, political applause. But in Ouagadougou, the reception was starkly different. Ibrahim Traoré sat in a dimly lit briefing room, elbows on the table, eyes fixed on the scrolling news. He had witnessed this choreography before. Smiling diplomats, rapid disbursements, glowing words about renewal. The pattern was familiar and the scent was foul. The IMF had not suddenly transformed into a charity. Its deals were never without strings. The question was not whether strings existed, but what they were made of. He did not need to wait long for the answer. The term sheets circulated with deliberate vagueness, concealed clause behind technical jargon. Commodity-secured stabilization, resource-backed amortization. To most, the words sounded clean, almost sterile. But to Traoré, the translation was plain. Barrels of oil pledged, tons of gold mortgaged, uranium royalties promised to clearinghouses far beyond African shores. It was collateral by another name, and collateral once surrendered, rarely returned. His cabinet shifted uneasily as he spoke. Moderate, why must we pledge what we already own to cancel what we never spent? The silence was heavy. A minister finally cleared his throat. Mr. President, they are not approaching us directly. They know your stance. They are circling us through our friends. Traoré nodded grimly. Already, neighboring governments were signing. Nearly $2 billion of obligations vanished in Dar. Copper and cobalt were exchanged in Kinshasa. Offshore crude was pledged as assurance in a coastal state. The language sounded harmless, until one realized adjustable assurance always favored the creditor. Meanwhile, Western media rolled out a wave of praise. Anchors framed the initiative as visionary. Think tanks called it a model for the developing world. Diplomats in Paris and London hosted receptions, toasting to African leadership, while quietly noting which governments had signed and which had not. Burkina Faso's absence was already being labeled obstinacy. But Traoré was not alone. Late one night, he gathered a circle of economists, auditors, and intelligence officers. We form a unit, he said quietly. Quiet, fast, relentless. Follow the contracts, the banks, the intermediaries. If this is clean, we will see it. If it is a net, we will feel the pull. There was no fanfare, no official acronym. Just 12 individuals with a mandate. Follow the money. They began tracing wire transfers, fee structures, clearing channels. Quickly, patterns emerged. Funds destined for African treasuries took long, expensive detours through Western banks. Consulting fees appeared with clockwork regularity, siphoned off before a single classroom was funded or a clinic supplied. And behind the neat columns of numbers, a darker truth surfaced. Valuation clauses were designed to trap. If gold prices spiked, the obligations expanded. If oil prices fell, the pledge extended. It was a game rigged both ways. Heads they win, tails we lose, whispered one young analyst from Kaya as dawn broke over her spreadsheets. The words lingered in the air. The deeper they dug, the clearer the trap became. This was not relief. It was leverage disguised as kindness. It was a noose braided from Africa's own resources, offered as if it were a lifeline. And yet, at this stage, the investigation was only scratching the surface. For all the patterns, the contracts, and the fees, one question loomed unanswered. Who truly designed this structure? The IMF may have been the stage, but who was the playwright? The answer lay in a single phrase, hidden in the correspondence of consultants, Phoenix Architecture. The name meant little at first, but soon it would reveal the hand behind the grandest financial coup of the century. The first clue was an email, buried in a chain between IMF staff and a private consultancy. The subject line read, Phoenix Architecture. Attached was a deck of slides. Dry phrases littered the pages. Digital settlement layer, commodity-backed stability, anchor optics. But then, a single annotation froze the room. At the bottom of a page in faint type, Advisory DJ Trump. For a moment, silence weighed heavier than words. This was no anonymous consultancy or faceless technocrat. This was the former president of the United States, a man who had teased for months the arrival of a digital dollar to rival China's yuan. On podiums across America, Trump had called it the patriotic coin of freedom. Now, in confidential attachments, the missing piece was clear. Without Africa's gold, uranium, and oil, the Phoenix dollar was just code. With them, it became unbreakable. Traore closed the folder slowly. They have learned from the last fight, he said. No soldiers at our ports, no sanctions shouted from rooftops. This time they will sign our brothers and use our brothers to corner us. His advisors urged an immediate press conference, but he shook his head. Truth shouted too early is dismissed as anger. Truth delivered with evidence becomes judgment. We need the chain, contracts, wires, names, dates, signatures. When we speak, we cannot miss. For weeks, the Financial Investigation Unit worked relentlessly. They tracked clearing banks. They cross-referenced procurement records. They uncovered consultants who designed loans, valued commodities, processed collateral, and drafted PR talking points. The same firms appearing again and again, a closed-loop manufacturing inevitability. Then came the final page, a slide titled Phoenix Dollar Commodity Stabilization Thesis. In tiny print, it listed Africa's resource-backed programs as non-correlated anchor optics for global stability. The left hand canceled debt. The right hand tightened chains. That was the moment Traore knew the evidence was ready. The square in Ouagadougou was packed before dawn. Farmers with dust on their hats. Students clutching notebooks. Miners still in their work clothes. Radios crackled in distant villages as loudspeakers echoed through the city. They had been promised not hope but evidence. Traore walked on stage carrying a folder, not a script. His voice cut through the humid night. They call it debt relief. But what is relief that demands our gold? What is freedom that chains our oil? Today, I will not give you slogans. I will give you contracts. Page by page, he read aloud. Collateral clauses in uranium. Adjustable valuation rights. Consulting fees siphoned before a single school was funded. Then he raised the slide, the Phoenix Dollar Thesis with Trump's name etched at the bottom. They are not canceling debts, he declared, voice rising. They are drafting a new currency built on our backs. They call it innovation. I call it a coup without soldiers. For a heartbeat, silence held the crowd. Then a roar thundered across the square. Chants erupted. Cancel the contracts! Cancel the chains! The broadcast spread across the continent. In Bamako, students replayed the clip on giant screens. In Nairobi, miners marched with placards. Our uranium is not your guarantee. In Kinshasa, parliamentarians brandished leaked documents on the floor, demanding answers. Western media scrambled to contain the story. Anchors framed Traore as obstinate, naive, too young to grasp global finance. A Parisian broadcaster asked if he was simply too inexperienced. But in African markets, people did not argue about technicalities. They argued about bread that still cost too much, clinics still without medicine, salaries still late. Debt relief had promised salvation, but life remained unchanged. The revelation hit like a storm. Opposition leaders demanded annulment of IMF contracts. Activists distributed translated copies of the term sheets in Swahili, French, Arabic, Hausa. Ordinary citizens could now read clauses for themselves. They did not need pundits to explain. And when Trump himself dismissed Traore on television, this young man does not understand finance. He should thank us. The words backfired spectacularly. Across African airwaves, callers repeated his phrase with fury. They want us to thank them for stealing from us. The IMF issued statements of denial. Spokespeople called the leaks misinterpretations. But every denial only fueled suspicion. One leaked European memo admitted bluntly, "The Africans have caught us." What had begun as a midnight investigation in Ouagadougou was now a continental reckoning. And for the first time in decades, Africa's silence was broken. The question now was no longer about contracts. It was about survival. Would nations endure the pressure to cancel the chains or collapse under the weight of retaliation? The revelation spread faster than fire on dry grass. Within days, protests erupted not only in Burkina Faso, but across the continent. In Bamako, university students carried photocopies of the leaked clauses. In Kinshasa, miners marched through the streets, chanting that their cobalt was not collateral. In Dakar, opposition leaders confronted ministers on the parliamentary floor, waving contracts like weapons. Ordinary life, already fragile, grew tense. Bread prices climbed, fuel costs soared, and schools cut back hours. Farmers asked why debt relief had not lowered fertilizer costs. Teachers wondered why salaries still arrived late. Mothers queued outside clinics, where medicines promised under relief never appeared. The IMF had promised oxygen, yet families still gasped for air. The disconnect between grand announcements and lived reality hardened anger into resolve. In Ouagadougou, neighborhood committees formed vigilance groups. They tracked rumors, exposed provocateurs, and used radios to debunk IMF talking points. In Niamey, activists launched social media accounts posting clauses line by line, annotated in plain language. One post read, "If gold prices rise, the obligation rises too. If oil prices fall, the pledge lasts longer. Heads they win, tails we lose." The phrase became a chant, echoing in markets and bus stations. Governments that had rushed to sign IMF contracts suddenly faced fierce domestic backlash. In Dar es Salaam, lawmakers confronted ministers with printouts of the Phoenix Dollar memos. A vote was forced to suspend compliance. In Kinshasa, opposition parties demanded annulment of collateral agreements. Even in capitals where governments remained loyal, the political cost was rising sharply. Western media attempted damage control. Editorials in Paris and London painted Burkina Faso as reckless, accusing Traore of risking stability. But the narrative had shifted. African citizens no longer needed outside analysis. They had the documents in their hands. The IMF's language of partnership now sounded hollow, a euphemism for dependency. As pressure mounted, the IMF tightened its grip. Contracts were redrafted with stricter clauses. Disbursements were delayed. Grain shipments bound for Sahel ports were suddenly inspected in Europe, delaying arrivals. Insurance rates for African exports climbed overnight. The message was clear: resistance would be punished. Yet the punishment did not break the will of the people. In Ouagadougou, a woman told a reporter, "Better hungry and free than fed with chains." Her words spread across radios like wildfire. Each hardship only deepened the conviction that dignity was worth the cost. It was in this climate that international commentators began branding Traoré not as a head of state, but as a rebel against the global order. Some Western analysts described his defiance as the Ibrahim Traoré Coup, not against his own people, but against the financial empire that had long dictated Africa's future. For supporters across the continent, the label became a badge of honor. Inside Burkina Faso's cabinet, debates were fierce. Some ministers argued the cost was too high. Fuel shortages, rising food prices, diplomatic isolation. But Traoré remained resolute. "They can stop our ships. They can block our loans, but they cannot cancel our truth. And truth is more powerful than their contracts." His conviction steadied the government at a time when pressure could have fractured it. Meanwhile, fear was weaponized. Financial markets trembled. Investors threatened to pull back. Speculators drove currencies downward. Grain futures rose steeply, pushing prices higher in local markets. The IMF and its allies sought to create panic, to convince Africans that dignity was too expensive. But panic met resistance. Community radio stations read contracts aloud. Villagers debated clauses as though they were judges. Teachers explained terms to students who then carried the arguments back to their families. It was a new kind of literacy, financial self-defense. In European capitals, frustration leaked. One banker admitted in Brussels, "The Africans have caught us. If these contracts collapse, the whole structure falls." The comment circulated widely on social media, fueling the sense that a continental battle was unfolding. For decades, African debt had been a silent burden, negotiated behind closed doors, written in the language of creditors. Now, for the first time, those doors had been thrown open, and what people saw inside shocked them. The question was no longer whether African citizens would resist, but whether their governments would stand firm or bow once more under international pressure. As the fire spread across Africa, the world watched uneasily. In Washington, the revelation struck at the heart of a strategy years in the making. Trump, furious at the collapse of the Phoenix Dollar Project, demanded escalation. He urged allies to tighten sanctions, freeze African reserves in European banks, and blacklist Sahel ports. On television, he dismissed Traoré as too young to understand finance, but in private, he barked orders. Break him before others follow. Yet the backlash was swift. In African radio stations, callers replayed his words with outrage. They want us to thank them for stealing from us. Instead of undermining Traoré, the statement only strengthened his image as a defender of African dignity. In Brussels, bankers whispered their fears. Without African resources, the Phoenix dollar lacked credibility. Some admitted that the contracts were radioactive. Quietly, investors began to withdraw. But publicly, European leaders clung to the IMF narrative, insisting the program was misunderstood. Their denials rang hollow. The African Union faced a dilemma. Some members urged caution, fearing reprisals from donors. Others demanded collective defiance. In ECOWAS, tempers flared as governments that had signed contracts were now forced to justify them before restless parliaments. The cracks within regional blocs widened. Meanwhile, new players circled. BRICS nations extended discreet offers of support, hinting at alternative financing structures. Gulf states expressed interest in direct resource trade, bypassing Western intermediaries. For decades, Africa's financial choices had been framed as binary: IMF compliance or collapse. Suddenly, there was another path. The symbolism was as powerful as the policy. For the first time in a generation, African leaders spoke not as isolated states, but as a chorus. Traoré's defiance resonated beyond borders, transforming into a continental call for sovereignty. Commentators began calling it the Burkina Faso Revolution. Not a violent upheaval, but a revolution of contracts, of dignity, of refusal. In Paris, a veteran anchor asked if Africa was sliding into dangerous independence. In London, an editorial admitted the unthinkable. We risk pushing Africa into rival systems. What was once praised as debt relief was now framed as colonialism reborn. The battle lines had shifted. This was no longer simply about one contract in Ouagadougou. It was about the future architecture of global finance, and whether Africa would forever remain collateral or finally become sovereign. All eyes now turned to Bamako, where leaders of the Sahel Alliance were preparing to meet. Would they fracture under pressure, or would they unite in defiance? The air in Bamako was heavy with expectation. Delegations from across the Sahel arrived under tight security, flags fluttering in the dusty wind. For decades, African leaders had responded to IMF dictates one by one, state by state, each isolated in negotiation. But now, for the first time, they were gathering to decide together. When Traoré took the podium, the hall fell silent. His voice was steady, his words deliberate. We have shown the fraud. We have shown the chains hidden in relief. Now we must act. Alone they punish us. Together they cannot touch us. The chamber erupted in applause. By the summit's close, a joint resolution was passed. Member states pledged to review, suspend, or cancel IMF agreements containing collateral clauses. They committed to exploring regional financing alternatives, drawing interest from partners in BRICS and the Gulf. Symbolically, the decision was seismic. Africa had refused to bow, not as scattered voices, but as a bloc. On the ground, solidarity deepened. Farmers trucked grain across borders to ease shortages. Community radios urged patience, reminding listeners that dignity required sacrifice. Better to lose their loans than to lose our future became the refrain of marketplaces and classrooms. Families tightened belts, but they did not fracture. The risks were undeniable. Fuel remained scarce, prices high, and sanctions loomed. Yet beneath the hardship lay a new confidence. For years, Africa's economic story had been written abroad, in Washington, Paris, London. Now a different narrative was taking root. It was not a story of pity or dependency, but of agency. International analysts debated the implications. Some warned of instability, predicting collapse without Western credit. Others saw opportunity, the possibility of an Africa charting its own path, trading resources on its own terms, leveraging partnerships beyond the IMF's reach. The very uncertainty was proof that something had shifted. For Traoré, the struggle was never about a single contract or even a single program. It was about reclaiming the principle that no nation should mortgage its lifeblood for the illusion of relief. In his words, we do not need to invent a new currency to be free. We need only protect the oldest one, the consent of our people. As the summit concluded, the leaders stood together beneath a canopy of flags, their colors blending in the fading light. It was an image that carried beyond Bamako, across Africa, across oceans. Whatever hardships awaited, a door had been opened, and behind it lay the possibility of sovereignty unchained. Yet the hardest question remained unanswered. Would Africa's unity endure when the weight of retaliation pressed harder, or would the cracks of hunger and pressure break the fragile alliance? On paper, Burkina Faso had lost. No billions flowed into its treasury. No new credit lines filled its reserves. Ships of grain still arrived late, and fuel still weighed heavy on families. To many observers, it looked like defeat. But in truth, something far greater had been won. For the first time in decades, Africans had looked at the fine print and said no. They had refused to trade their children's future for someone else's experiment. And they had done it not because a foreign power dictated it, but because one of their own leaders had dared to put the evidence on the table. Ibrahim Traoré stood in Bamako at the close of the Sahel summit, flanked by the flags of Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso. His words echoed with the weight of history. They thought our silence was ignorance. They thought our hunger was weakness. But hunger has not broken us. Silence has not blinded us. We have seen their contracts. We have read their lies. And today, Africa cancels not just their agreements, but the very idea that our resources are theirs to command. Commentators called it the Burkina Faso Revolution. Not a revolution of guns and barricades, but of contracts and dignity. A continent had stared into the trap and stepped back together. The Phoenix dollar collapsed. The IMF initiative lay in ruins. And across the continent, from villages to parliaments, a new conviction grew. Africa would no longer be collateral. Of course, challenges remain. Sanctions may tighten, markets may punish, hunger may bite. But truth has a power greater than contracts, and unity has a strength no lender can calculate. What began as one leader's defiance has become a continental awakening. Some labeled it the Ibrahim Traoré Coup, an act of rebellion against the global order. In the eyes of millions, it was the opposite, an act of sovereignty reclaimed. This, then, is the legacy. Not charity, not pity, but dignity. Not debt relief that chains, but freedom that costs. A voice once dismissed as too young has become the voice of a generation. If this story of courage and sovereignty speaks to your heart, do not let it fade. Share it, comment on it, and above all, subscribe, so that together we continue to walk with those who dare to say no.